You have lived in New York for a while now.
Yeah, I've been in New York for almost 21 years.
Okay, and then I'm sorry, you moved from Switzerland to New York, or there was some other place you were in between.
So that's correct. I finished high school in Geneva or just outside Geneva, and I moved here for college. And so
Yeah,
I've been pretty much ever since.
that's excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to introduce you properly. My name is Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. This is my podcast, and I am talking to Atossa Abrahamian today, who is the author of a book that I just finished this morning on, I'll call it facetiously, international wealth management, really how to hide money in Switzerland and lots of other places. And we share something that I'm going to get into a little bit here, Atusa, because I was born and raised in Switzerland. Now, were your parents Swiss?
Sort of. No, not at the time of my birth. My mother subsequently became Swiss because we lived there for a long time, but they were Iranian citizens. I
Okay.
was in Canada, but I was raised 100% in Geneva.
Yeah, and you're basically the child of diplomats.
UN people, yeah, same.
UN people. Well, I am the child of evangelical missionaries, and there's a weird connection between your book and my childhood in that, as I'm sure you know, because you grew up in the international community in Geneva, the Swiss are very good at two things which sort of distinguish them from everybody else. And I'm not talking about chocolates and watches. I'm talking about hiding other people's money, including very bad people. Um, you know, the other thing they were very good at was creating mercenary militaries that fought all over the world for whoever would hire you. So they're very kind of hard-eyed people in that they, hired anyone out to kill anybody for a price, including in Africa, which most people don't think of in Switzerland. But the other weird thing the Swiss are very good at, and that I know something about, is tolerating and somehow allowing a range of diverse religious cults and sects in the country, which are rather unique to Switzerland. And why that is, we'll take another book. Someone will have to write the book on the why and wherefore of that. But in addition to hiding money, if you Google any far-fetched cult sect and you find that it has a European um, place at all, like it's likely to be in Switzerland, that and weird health food stuff. Um, I just read a book by Christian Kracht, who's a Swiss novelist who wrote a book called Eurotrash that won all sorts of awards. He writes in German. And I read a fantastic translation into English. And it's strange because it was like a preparation for your book. I don't know if you know the novel.
I've been asked to review it. I was asked to review it. I dropped the ball. I should have read it at the time because you're the third person in 5 days that's recommended it to me.
Yeah.
So next on the list. Yeah.
Well, you should read it because I think this is the British edition, and you only have the British edition of your book. So this is the Eurotrash British edition.
Okay.
And the thing is, like your book, Eurotrash is set in my backyard, including even ski lifts that I've been on, the Telecabine up to Diablerie to the glacier up there,
Yeah.
the Montreux tea rooms that I know well. Um, and I'm going to tell you what it's about because it really sets your book up well. It's a very amusing. I was scared of it when I heard he won awards in Switzerland for literature. It sort of terrified me in the same way that when I hear that someone's won a Nobel Prize for literature, I'm probably not going to read that book. It always scares me.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I saw an excerpt somewhere and I heard a bit on the BBC about it and I read it. And it's a very amusing concept because it's someone whose money was hidden in Switzerland by a father who was a Nazi. And this mother who's now got Alzheimer's and her middle-aged 50-year-old son empty her bank accounts and set out literally with bags of cash to give the money away to whoever they meet. And so it's a really odd, quirky little book, but it has a direct connection to your book because
Yes.
it's as if one of the characters in your book suddenly had a crisis of conscience, or in this case, becomes demented and decides to go get 1,000 franc bills, wads of cash, hundreds of thousands of francs, and just hand out bagfuls. And then it ties into my life because one of the places they stop by to give the money away is a weird off-the-wall cult that owns a couple of chalets near Diableret. And some of the members of the cult then find out that they've got all this cash with them and try to rob them in the night. So it kind of got everything in it. So let's go to your book here now. Um, so my guest is Atossa and Abrahamian, and she is an independent journalist who writes about the cracks in the nation state system. She is a former editor at The Nation and Al Jazeera America, and her reporting and criticism have appeared in the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now she is the author of this book that I just read that I'm just flabbergasted by how good it is. And it ties in so closely to my own experience of life as someone who grew up in Switzerland. The Hidden Globe, How Wealth Hacks the World. So this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Please subscribe right now on YouTube, and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple and Spotify podcasts, and to my Substack commentary page, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And this book that we're talking about today is our July offering for It Has to Be Read. So that's all the boilerplate. So first of all, talk about your childhood in Geneva, and then I'll tell you a little bit about mine, and then we'll dive into your book.
Yeah, Frank, I have many questions for you. So, I was the child, or am the child of UN functionaries. My father was an economist at UNCTAD, and my mother was a career interpreter at the Secretariat, but she, had gigs all over. And after living in a bunch of different, they were both born in Iran, but after living in a bunch of places, they settled in Geneva, bought an apartment. My brother and I were born abroad in Canada, but we were raised totally in Switzerland. And I say we were raised in Switzerland, but we were really in a kind of unique little enclave of Geneva, which was Geneva's international community.
Sure.
This meant that, we went to international schools for the most part. We had friends who moved around a lot. I spent a lot of sick days in the UN building in my dad's office. So it was like kind of cloistered and a bit of a bubble.
Hmm.
And this was in really nice ways. There is something so lovely when people from all over the world come together and form a real life community. You're breathing and living and eating and sleeping and
Yeah.
people from all over. It's wondrous. It's incredible, and it's given me a real taste for the world, right?
Mhm.
But at the same time, we were in a place that I barely knew, in retrospect. We didn't learn Swiss history. I spoke French because I did activities. I mean, I lived in
Sure.
Geneva, but I didn't really have a good grasp of like what Swiss culture was. And beyond the sort of cosmetic things, I didn't feel particularly Swiss.
Yeah.
This only began to matter after I left. And so when I left Switzerland, these, usual questions arise when you're deciding, well, where are you going to get a job? Where are you going to live? Who are you going to marry? Where are you from? And I realized I couldn't really answer that question very well. I had
Hmm.
many answers, but there was no firm answer. And that got me thinking about why that was and what the role of Geneva's international community had in bringing this state of affairs about.
Yeah. Hiding money, hiding art, hiding wealth, and helping people steal wealth from countries in Africa, African leaders, Saudis. You
Right.
know,
So going on.
basically what your book is about is that if there are any bad actors in the world who also happen to be rich, at some point their paths cross Swiss bankers and lawyers who help shelter and hide their money. And I know this isn't what your book is about, but you wrote it during the first Trump administration, or did you get in on the tail end of the second Trump administration? If it came out uh, in 2024, my guess is you wrote, when you talk about Trump, you're talking about his first administration.
Yeah, I sold the book. You pitch books before they're published. You have a proposal, you take it to publishers, as you well know.
Yeah,
Uh, I sold it the day before lockdown, the first COVID lockdown. So it was
sure.
a Trump and most of Biden. Um,
Yeah,
but
and the funny thing is, I know that in reading it, but in a weird way, all the worst case scenario predictions your book might be, extrapolated to have made in a way about wealth and unfairness and the gap between the wealthy and the poor growing. Um, anything that the Trump administration has gotten into with their own bitcoins and all this kind of stuff, and the level of corruption that is part of the Trump administration at this point, with all these billionaires as part of it, in a weird way, your book is sort of ripped from the headlines because if ever wealth and wealthy people and this sort of subculture of, from Dubai to Luxembourg to whatever, as I read your book, it was basically like a roadmap
Yeah.
to everybody from Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump's son-in-law. I mean, they're all in the book in a way that's who you're talking about.
Yeah, they're on the circuit. I mean, you have the all of so Geneva is just the starting point for this world where people hide money and hide art and sort of get away with things. But then it's inspired many, many imitators around the world. And so now we don't just have one Geneva, we have Genevas everywhere.
Yeah.
And through
And
the
that was
trans
something that I learned in your book that I really didn't know before. I mean, one is aware of people talk about Singapore being the new Switzerland, or Hong Kong was for a while, but the depth of the international circuit of the super wealthy and the way they manipulate and hide their money and the trillions of dollars in unpaid taxes internationally because of this, the kind of last thing we needed, like a hole in the head, was a Trump administration that then sides with these people and lets, even more people off the hook in terms of any accountability, it seems to me.
Definitely, definitely. And this also applies in a sort of a human rights context, right? Because when we're thinking about places where you can get away with things, okay, you have money laundering, or you're hiding money from taxes, or you're even just hiding a Picasso from your ex-wife. There are places where you can do this. But then now what's emerging globally is this use of third spaces to just put entire populations that are unwanted. So when we're hearing about the prisons in El Salvador, we're hearing about Guantanamo Bay reopening as a migrant camp. We have the
Yeah.
same logic at play, right? It's like find somewhere else to do the dirty business and
Yeah.
send people or send money or send things away. And I think that what you've really identified is that the Trump administration understands this logic, right? It's the logic of oligarchs. It's the logic of kind of shady people who know their ways around the
Sure.
world. Very clever. There's no denying it. It's very clever and it's very insidious. And they understand completely how the world works, and they're trying to use it to their advantage.
Yeah, I was born in Switzerland in 1952, and I'm 72 now. I'll be 73 this summer. And I lived there. Jeannie and I got married when we were teenagers. We had our first two kids in Switzerland. She came to the States pregnant with her third in 1980. So I lived there as a child. I lived there as a school child. I lived there as a teenager. And then I lived there as a young adult with two children and a wife, with two of my kids, who are my oldest kids now, in the Swiss school system. And then I have nieces and nephews who still live in Switzerland, one of whom works for the Swiss tax office, making international agreements on stuff. And he's, very much part of this system, I guess. Um, One thing I found a parallel to your book with my life is that, when you're younger, you just sort of take everything around you for granted. Okay, my parents are these weird Americans living in a small Swiss village. Nobody likes us because we're in this weird Christian community, but it just seemed normal to have a ski resort up the road, and you would see famous people, you got to know people, and so forth and so on. And then later, much later, it dawns on you, wait a minute, Switzerland is a one-off. There are these other places that shelter income, but no one has done it for as long or as well as the Swiss have. And, going all the way back to hiding Nazi gold. And then before that, the mercenary forces the Swiss would rent out to despots all over the world. Um, so let's just sort of start with the basic premise of your book. I have a lot of quotes that I want to talk about here, but let me begin just by talking about the table of contents. There is an introduction, city of holes, good fences, white cube, black box, in the zones, hacking the world, the city and the city. Let's see, Ad Astra, Titanic, Excise, Laos Vegas, Terra Nullius. Then you have basically the book is set up with a really terrific introduction, and you start, and I'll just read a bit to you. I began this book about the world on a lifelong hunch. there was something strange about the place where I grew up. And you had me at that sentence,
No,
by the way. That's my whole life. And I've written memoirs, and I'm still trying to figure out not just what my parents were to the evangelical world, but your next sentence, that place is the Swiss city of Geneva, though its location doesn't tell the whole story. Geneva hosts the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and so forth. Well, the thing is, the way this ties into my own background is that, um, as I said, there are a lot of cults in Switzerland, and we were uniquely part of the Swiss system in the sense that besides hiding people's money, um, the Swiss have this thing that goes back into Calvinist Geneva of giving shelter to dissidents and people who were running away. But then that translated into, okay, well, we'll also hide your money for you. And then we'll bank your money and we'll figure out how to make more money with your money. And if you do return to where you came from and they want you to pay taxes, we'll fix it so you don't have to. And so the first thing I want to zero in on, because you did this history brilliantly in your book, how did we get from Calvinist Geneva? And by the way, I grew up in a Calvinist household. My father was a Calvinist theologian. This was our hero.
that's no fun at all,
No.
Frank.
Okay. So this is how I grew up. And I know all about Zwingli and Calvin and William Farel and the Swiss the part of Switzerland I was in and all the rest of it. Um, but how did the Swiss go from Calvinist theology, which was sort of puritanical when it came to personal behavior, and then wind up taking that work ethic and becoming international brokers for the wealthiest thieves in the world and sheltering their income in Switzerland, and yet doing it with this sort of Calvinist work ethic, tied back into having taken in refugees, whether it's Huguenots or other Protestants who were being persecuted, and then others. You talk about the Medici Bank already being in Geneva. So paint a picture for us, whether, how does the Medici Bank fit in with Calvinist Geneva later, or, whenever it happens? How does this purist theology become the basis of an international corruption ring, the likes of which there's never been? Then you have this interview with this Swiss who, gets death threats because he's written honestly about it.
Yeah.
I
Let's
don't
just
think anybody has a clue when they land in Geneva or Zurich where they are. And I want
right.
you to take a good long chunk now and explain it.
All right, so we can go even before Calvin, and that's to the 1200s and the 1300s. And Switzerland was not even a state as we know it. Actually, the
Right.
whole world looked very different, but Switzerland, there were a bunch of cantons.
Yeah.
And the cantons didn't have a lot going for them. They were very poor. There wasn't a lot of industry. All these young men running around without jobs. It's never good, right? And so the cantons come up with a solution, and that is this. They're surrounded by warring monarchs, much more powerful and rich than they are.
Yeah.
These guys, they want one thing, they want fighters. Swiss can provide that. They've got way too many young men running around with no jobs. They don't have a lot of money, so they train these forces and they become very adept at fighting in foreign wars. They train young men to go out and sort of rent them out as mercenaries.
Yeah.
Um, and so the Swiss can then buy commodities, they can buy salt to produce cheese. This is good for the Swiss economy. It also keeps people busy, stops nasty things like revolutions from happening, right?
Yeah.
Because men are all gone, or not all, but they're occupied. So
Yeah.
this is prehistory, right? You have these proto states finding ways to make money out of nothing, or out of nothing. I mean, out of very few natural resources. They're
Sure.
using young men's bodies. Fast forward. Um, the world evolves, global marketplaces evolve. Geneva, in this case, becomes a crossroads for trade. So a lot of traders are coming through from France, from Italy, from Germany. They're just crossing Europe. And Geneva becomes an outpost, right? So there's more industry, banks become established, it gets a little bit more prominent. And Geneva's location is, I said that they didn't have anything going for them. They had a very fortuitous location. There's a river. Um, it's close to a lot of things, so it's pretty easy to get to and from.
Yeah.
Uh, so there's this like spirit of the thing, right? We're gonna find a way to make money even though we got nothing. Then you have something, you create a marketplace, right?
Yeah.
You might not have the most commodities or goods, but you can be the place where they stop and get traded and sold. So then
Yeah.
Geneva becomes a marketplace. Um, Fast forward some more years, Europe is having a lot of problems with religion, and Protestants have to flee neighboring France and other countries. Geneva says, "Oh, well, sure, come here. We'll protect you. You can come here," thinking again, this is an opportunity for us. We'll be a city of refuge, and we will also put you to work, and you will bring riches to our city state at the time. So it's not like a straight line from the mercenaries to the reform hosting the refugees of the
Sure.
Reformation. You can see the common logic there, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then Calvin comes to town, and you could probably say more about this than I can, but just really overhauls the
And
city.
Calvin's French.
Yeah, Calvin's French. He's coming from Strasbourg, if
Yeah.
I'm correctly. So the Genevans, if they bring him in, he stays for a bit, he leaves, and then he comes back, and he's really tasked with whipping Geneva into shape because it is a sinful place at the time, and he succeeds. And he, brings his teachings with him, and Geneva becomes this very industrious, very austere center, still of trade, right? Of there's industry, there's banks at this point. And so this mentality emerges, and it's hard to say, this happened and this happened and this
Sure.
happened. But basically, the teachings of the Protestants at the time and of the reformers was that, well, there's no sure way to know if you're the elect or if you're going to heaven, but like you better put your head down and work hard, and like maybe that'll increase your chances. Maybe this will
Yeah.
help you. And people are freaked out, like they don't know about science, or like they just this is what they believe, so they do what he says. And this kind of work ethic emerges, this famous Protestant work ethic.
Yeah.
I guess the way I summarize it is that nothing that's worth everything worth having is worth hiding. So you
Yeah.
don't want here to be, lavish or decadent. You want to make money, you want to do all of this good stuff, but you want to keep it behind closed doors. And I think that this notion of like walling off, of fencing off wealth, of hiding things, of being very discreet and very quiet and very private, I think that you can pick up on that if you land in Geneva just by walking through the airport, like all of the ads for the watches or the ads for the private banks are really leaning into this discretion, this tastefulness, this privacy. And that's very appealing for the global ultra rich,
Yeah.
whether that's, they want to feel like they're being classy, or they don't want to arouse too much interest from the tax authorities. I mean, there are many advantages to this kind of way of doing things that the Swiss have perfected.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, too, part of the Calvinist ethic, and this is, of course, incredibly ironic. Switzerland's a good place to live in many ways. It certainly was when I grew up there. I remember my wife, Jeannie, had just come from California, and one time she dropped a 100 franc note. And that would be like $100 today, but sort of worth 300 or something back in 1980 at the Migros, which is the supermarket. And because it was Switzerland, she called up about an hour later, said, I dropped some money. And they said, well, we did find a 100 franc note. Someone turned it in. And what aisle were you in? And they sort of asked some questions so she could identify where she was. And she went down and they handed her the money and the cash. Someone had turned the cash in. And then being Switzerland, they said, well, of course, you owe them 10% reward because that's the law.
Yeah.
So here you have a country where if you drop a 100 franc note, at least back in 1980, someone's going to find it and turn it in. Same with a briefcase, on your car that's parked and you drive off and drop it. You come back a week later, it'll be at the police station or the post office or somewhere. So there's this kind of surface decency and honesty, which Switzerland is unique for compared to any other European country, even back in the day when I was there. And yet there's this sort of state-sponsored larceny on a global scale of ripping off, every single country that an African dictator ever stole its wealth from, Russian oligarchs and so forth. So before we move on, I'm just not putting you on the spot. I don't have an answer for this, but how do you get this kind of very pious Calvinist individual honesty? Everybody has their maîtrise fédérale. There's no such thing as a bad carpenter in Switzerland. They all had to take tests. They're exactly who they say they are. If you hang your shingle out as a carpenter, an electrician, or a mason, you really know how to do shit. unlike the States where it's sort of a free-for-all, you just hope you get somebody good. And yet, on the other hand, when you look at the banks in Zurich and in Geneva, particularly, um, they have organized themselves into basically a global criminal racket. How do you put those two things together? Why the private honesty on the one hand coming from Calvinism, and then on a big scale internationally, this sort of other thing?
Well, I'll answer that in two parts. One is that it's not criminal if you make it legal. And if you make the law, you can make whatever you want legal, right?
Right.
So like a basic tenet of the way that this hidden globe works. But on the other hand, I think that there's Switzerland is a lovely place to live. It's a lovely place to visit. And I think that a lot of what you benefit from there is at the expense of the rest of the world. So would Switzerland be as prosperous as it is today had it not accommodated so many ill-gotten gains? Probably not. Look, they're very clever. They might have come up with other ways, but this was a really fundamental building block to get to where Switzerland is today. And so, yeah, hiding money for foreign dictators is a part of that. And there's just a sense of if it doesn't happen here, it's not our problem. We just deal with what we have here. We're going to keep it clean. We're going to keep it nice. We're going to return your $100 bill. By the way, I once lost my wallet that included that I was in college. I had a fake ID in the wallet.
That's great.
I had a fake ID that was addressed to an address in Fort Lee, New Jersey, a place I have never been.
Hmm.
And I went back to the store where I dropped the wallet. Oh, where did it go? Oh, we gave it to the police. I figured it out. I figured out where it was. They said, "Oh, but we sent it back to New Jersey."
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, well, it worked too well at that point. The thing is, the Swiss mantra is we don't care what you did in the country of origin. Bokassa steals all the money from wherever he arrives, or an oligarch. Putin has a chalet up in Villars, which was the ski resort I grew up in. God knows where, he got that money, and all the rest of it. Certainly not off his paycheck as the head of state, and on and on and on. And yet their idea is, well, as long as you're not doing it here, we don't care. We'll give you privacy.
More or less. And look, I think it's gotten a lot better since you're probably remembering the 70s, the 60s. Like it was really quite sinister then. Since then Switzerland has entered agreements with the European Union, with G20 countries through the OECD. Like they've become, active participants in the world of nations. They joined the UN, which they didn't do for a long time. So I don't think we're dealing with exactly what this is not no longer the Wild West of the Swiss banks in the 60s. But again, I think that this mentality endures. And so what you can't do with banking anymore, maybe you can do with cryptocurrency. There's always the next thing. And again, they make it very sanitized and they find ways to sort of adhere to the letter, if not the spirit of the law. But there's always going to be the next thing, and I think it's a useful place to look at what's cooking, because
Yeah,
Switzerland.
and what's cooking globally. So moving on from Switzerland in terms of all their imitators and also the kind of secondary hiding of wealth in the art market and these, places in Geneva, but all over the world where people put paintings and they're sort of beyond the pale of the tax man and so forth. Talk a little just about what you get into in the book in terms of this sort of international club that from the Saudis to Putin to the Trumps to, all these people, they're all in this club. First of all, what is the motivation for hiding all the money besides taxes? And then the second thing is how did this spread from Switzerland into the international community? I think that's so interesting in your book, how you do that.
Yeah, well, the reason for hiding money is usually to not have to pay it to someone, right? Whether that's the tax authority or a family member or a shareholder, or, I can only speculate. There's so many different scenarios. Historically, it started with taxes, right? And it wasn't because Switzerland had lower taxes, it's because other countries instituted income tax, neighboring countries. And so you're the well-off dentist or lawyer, what have you, just put it in the back of your car, drive over the border and put it in a Swiss bank. And that was a pretty easy way to do that. Now it's a lot harder to hide money, or it's harder and easier to hide. It's easier to transfer it because you don't have to drive it over a border anymore. it's harder because there are more controls for the movements of money. And if you've ever tried to send, I don't know, $150 to like a friend who's sending you a book from an African country, like you see how annoying and hard it is for ordinary people to just send a few dollars. There is equivalent of this in the international banking circuit. There are know your customers laws. There are various disclosures you have to make. So again, I don't want to oversimplify. Like these things have gotten quite a bit more stringent and more complicated. Um, but the motivation for doing so, for hiding, for moving your money, for putting it in a tax shelter, again, it's so that you can keep more of it, and that endures to this day. So if Switzerland was a pioneer, I think plenty of other countries have found business opportunities in various niches, helping people do this in new and interesting and novel ways. When one country says, "Okay, you can't do this anymore," another will pop up to allow them to. Um, there's a whole chapter that talks a lot about Luxembourg in the Hidden Globe as a sort of close cousin to Switzerland. So while the Swiss were kind of setting up their bank secrecy laws and helping people in that department, Luxembourg was doing the sort of corporate equivalent where they had a holding company law, whereby if you registered your corporation through a holding company in Luxembourg, you could also benefit from various tax advantages and have to pay less corporate tax because they were not taxing the holding company, right? So this is the famous holding company law there. Um, and Luxembourg really perfected this to sort of stratospheric heights. And I mean this literally,
Yeah.
because some 100 years later, Luxembourg was and successfully passed a law that recognizes private property in outer space. So you can think of outer space as sci-fi, but you can also think of outer space as the ultimate offshore location, right? Because if you hold wealth that you found on an asteroid that you mined somewhere in the universe, and if you hang on to it and you're out there, like who's even gonna?
Well, and you wrote about this international meeting where they said that, outer space or planets or the moon or whatever was sort of off limits. And you said it was sort of a rare occasion when everybody came together. But of course, practically speaking now with Elon Musk and the Chinese and everybody else, getting ready to mine the seabed and then eventually, the moon and so forth and so on, in the same way that space was not supposed to be militarized, but everybody sort of knows it has been. So obviously, the things we're doing here on Earth are not going to, they're all going to jump into the next century.
Definitely. Yeah. And to bring it back to Geneva, I mean, a lot of these meetings around how to govern outer space were
Yeah,
happening in and around the UN.
yeah,
Um, the problem was that the ambiguities in the various space laws that were drafted, the international ones, did not really account for what would happen when people were making money up in space. And so, it's pretty clear that countries cannot colonize space, but can they have their own laws recognize wealth, recognize private property? Well, it's true, whether or not the answer is yes or no, they're doing it. And Luxembourg is leading the way. So is the US, by the way. But soon this will be adopted all over the world. I think that these are first mover countries that really seize opportunities early on, and they do so in order to attract industry first.
yeah. One thing I found very interesting about your book, besides the all the Swiss references, which of course fascinated me because I grew up there, was the way this has spread. And I just want you to make a little bit of a jump here. I'm going to reintroduce your book just so we make sure we keep saying the name, and also mention your book is going to be our July book club. Um, but you've written a book called The Hidden Globe: How Wealth Hacks the World. Apropos of which, what do you think it costs the international community in total to have tax avoidance on this kind of $1 trillion level?
Well, trillions. But I think from a moral standpoint, if if the reason that people are going hungry and don't have homes
Hmm.
is that the state is not able to afford it, like that's absurd if you have all this money floating
Yeah.
around. Um, and I think that it is my firm belief that if states wanted to recoup all of this offshore wealth, they could. right? It's not like it's in a black hole. It's in other countries that you can put
Sure.
pressure on. Like there are things you can do if you can audit a poor person and like bust them for not paying 500 bucks in taxes, you can certainly do the same with extremely wealthy people.
Yeah.
Political will for this is not there right now.
Well, or
Certain,
put it this way, the people who are in charge certainly don't have the will for this. You talk about Singapore, like Switzerland, has made its fortune from close to nothing by making itself indispensable to the global capital. So, that's the kind of pattern. In other words, essentially, Switzerland does not have very good agriculture because it's 70% is uninhabitable because of the mountains, et cetera. They made something from nothing, both with sending their young men off to die in other people's wars or to fight them. And then, of course, then turned around in the 18th and 19th century and started selling the view. The Swiss were not skiers at that point, and they didn't climb their own mountains, but the British did. On the Grand Tour, they would stop, and they liked Switzerland. So all these grand hotels on the lake, like the Montreux Palace and so forth and so on, in Vevey the Trois Couronnes and in the whatever, all come from that era, including in Vevey, an Orthodox church for the Tsar and his family next to the station that was built because they would always take over the entire hotel for a month in the summers, I think it was, et
well,
cetera. So the Swiss have always had this relationship with high-end tourism as well, and that also has dovetailed. And I think when you look at Singapore and Luxembourg and so on, they've also managed to become hosts to very wealthy people who then live there and or visit quite often to bring their money, et cetera. There's a pattern there. I don't know how you would describe that pattern that ties all these havens together.
yeah, it's really a mentality, I think, and also the financial flows will often go from one to, they'll go from Switzerland to Luxembourg to Hong Kong to Singapore. Like there are ways to trace this as well.
Yeah.
Not always linear, and money takes some circuitous routes, but yeah, I mean, I think that the maybe another question you might be asking is like, what do these places have in common?
Yeah, and what's the pattern there? Because they're very disparate. When you think of Singapore and Switzerland, they're on opposite sides of the globe, but there's a great unanimity in the kind of people. And the same with the Gulf states. All of a sudden, these have emerged as similar places, run by the kind of people who have taken advantage of Switzerland. Now they're doing it in their own countries.
Yeah, definitely. And they're doing it for other people who want to go to their countries rather than Switzerland or in addition to Switzerland.
Yeah,
These things can sort of complement each other, right? So say you're an art collector who has antiquities that for a long time could be held in Switzerland, and then Switzerland joined some UNESCO treaties, can't do that anymore. Well, guess what? Singapore is not party to these treaties. You can just
yeah,
move it
you can do it there.
to one of those
One of the
two.
points you make in your book that I thought was very prescient, and you see a little bit already happening with the way the British, the Conservative Party, and this didn't work very well, but they were going to fly their people that they didn't want in the country to Rwanda. They cut a deal with Rwanda. And you have a section in your book, describe that in terms of this kind of outsourcing of people. Up to this point, we've been talking about wealthy people hiding their money and going to live in very lovely places that allow them to do pretty much what they want as long as they don't do it there. But there's another kind of outsourcing now that you see with Trump sending Americans off to um, prisons far
Yeah.
away that are just sort of out of sight, out of mind, and we'll forget about them up into including last week deporting a 1-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old who are American citizens, but their mother was a naturalized citizen and or on her way to that, or in his view, an illegal alien, but all of a sudden American children who
Yeah.
are dependents of these people, and then they're just sent off to somewhere else. Talk about that section of your book where you talk about this idea of in the same way that Switzerland provides the shelter economically to certain people, this idea of using other places to dump the unwanted. And then
Yeah.
you also had a positive idea of a sort of an idea of perhaps creating places. You mentioned some other person who's written about this, creating places where the unwanted could sort of go. And it's sort of an idea that I hadn't seen articulated before.
Yeah, so if you think about the logic of like tax avoidance, and I won't say evasion because evasion's legal, avoidance is in theory legal, right?
Yeah,
Is you take money and you put it somewhere where you don't have to pay as much tax. And in theory, this is if you see the Panama Papers, everyone was saying, oh, but it's legal. There's nothing, no wrongdoing here. So,
Sure.
right. But the logic is there's another place where you can get away with the stuff you want to do. By that same logic, if the US is bound by human rights treaties, or the UK is bound by European treaties that it's subscribed to, but it doesn't want to deport people back to a place that they can't deport them to, whether it's
Sure.
because the country won't take them or because they face danger. What more elegant option than to enlist a third country to take them in, pay that country to just take in people. So this has been happening. This is not new. This has been happening for years and years. Australia had a really notorious
Sure.
uh, decade of doing this, almost sending asylum seekers that were arriving by boat to either the nation of Nauru or the Manus Island, which is part of Papua New Guinea, and
Yeah.
essentially bankrolling detention centers in these two places. Everything about them was Australian, but for their location.
Mm.
But because they were not on Australian soil, Australia could say, hey, it's not ours, not our problem. We can't be held responsible for this sort of thing. And they weren't. It was very controversial. Australians came out against it ultimately, and it wasn't popular, but the Australian government didn't face any, like, they weren't taken to court over this, at the international court.
Yeah.
So, looking now at what the Trump administration is doing, re sort of staffing up at Guantanamo Bay, which, by the way, was originally also a migrant detention center before the War on Terror,
Mm.
and paying El Salvador, amongst other countries, to take in deportees. This is just more of the same. And it's, through Trump will say, well, these are people we don't want in our country, like, very openly. So let's send them somewhere else. Can't that send them home? We will find another place for them. It's pretty sinister, especially when you consider that these people have no say in where they ended up, right?
Sure.
Um, and my idea, which isn't even really my idea, and I wouldn't even say I endorse it fully, but if we're gonna do this, right? If we're not gonna let people into the United States, if we're just going to sort of indiscriminately send them to third countries that they never even wanted to go to, why not have another program where maybe they can choose to go to a fourth place that is set up to
Yeah.
be accommodate people? A city of, we talked about Geneva being a city of refuge. That's really powerful. Like, that's a really good thing. The people fleeing, the Protestants fleeing their home countries had good reason to leave, and they found a place to go. Wouldn't it be
Yeah.
great if we still had some version of that?
If there was something like that. An interesting thing is the kind of historical amnesia that your book is published into, at least in the United States. Um, when you think, for instance, what happened to Poland, and looks like it could happen again with the aggressiveness of Putin, certainly the Polish are worried about it. We cut a deal at Yalta between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, in which we allowed Stalin to do what Putin now wants to do to Ukraine, and that is to invade a country, which was Poland, that he cut a deal with the Nazis to invade at the same time. He killed their entire officer class in the Khatan Forest, about 5,000 people. Stalin liquidated their military. All the Polish troops who were supposedly now fighting on the side of Russia disappeared into the Gulag, and some of them were repatriated through these weird routes down into Iran, for one place, and then into North Africa, et cetera, et cetera. But what I'm trying to say is that, there's a kind of a substrata to history and the international community that, in addition to Geneva and the Swiss hiding people's money and the wealthy and so forth, when you look at what Russia has become today, we're seeing a repetition of history. They're doing to Ukraine what the Soviet Union did to Poland, and they want to do that and hang on to what they've gotten and so on. So I want to take a few minutes here to just look at your historical perspective, which I know you have because I read the book and it's there, not that specific example. But let's talk about let's fast forward your book to the present era. We're now in the middle of the second Trump administration. It's marked by three things: extreme wealth, a total disregard for the rule of law, and a favoring of the elite billionaire class, the likes of which the US has never seen in its history. And then this fourth thing, um, beginning to side with Vladimir Putin against Ukraine, sort of repeating the mistakes of Yalta, fast forward into the 21st century, where we're going to allow a Russian aggressor to have their way with this country and try to cut a deal that we call a peace deal. So with the fact that you grew up in a diplomatic family, that you are from somewhere else, that you yourself are from somewhere else, as in your background, okay, you moved to Switzerland.
Mhm.
Um, your book has a lot of sensitivity toward what I would call the historical context of what you talk about. So
Mhm.
let's talk about the historical context we're in now with the Trump administration. How does this figure into the broad strokes of your book? Because I know you think about this because I just read the book, and so I want to hear your thoughts of things that aren't in the book because you wrote it before the second Trump administration, but it just seems that everything has now become even more thrown into sharp relief. Everything you write about in your book suddenly is in sharp relief in my head because of where we are now. And I'd like you to talk about that.
Yeah. So I think that the second Trump term feels very different from the first.
Yeah,
And people that would have said things in the first, is it fascism? Is it this? Is it that? In the first Trump term, a lot of people are changing their minds now because it really does. It feels like we really are at an inflection point. It seems highly unlikely that in 3.5 years we're going to get another Biden type figure and kind of quote unquote go back to normal.
yeah,
What I spend a lot of time thinking about is what is globalization going to look like? Are we going to have it? Who's going to have it? Who's it going to serve? And are all of these nationalist movements actually deglobalizing?
yeah,
Um, I don't think they are. I think that they're just going to do globalization in their own way, in the
yeah,
different way. I call it national globalism. Right. So sort of the connotations very much intended with something that rhymes with national globalism. And I think that so it doesn't mean that they're going to try to go back to like autarky or close the border or end international
sure.
trade, disengage with the rest of the world. Um, I think that they're going to be doing it in a way that really just advances national interests. Rather, there's going to be not even a veneer of international cooperation or goodwill or, kumbaya that maybe even in the sort of neoliberal era we had.
Yeah,
Not that it was necessarily genuine or useful, but like people paid lip service to that. Those days are over. Um, Beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I wish I could tell you, but I think that we're entering a new phase of globalization that is not deglobalization. It is
mm,
just a different flavor, and it's got a different tone.
mm,
And I think that the rich people will continue to be rich. They're going to continue to get away with all the things and have all of the advantages. And I don't think it's yet again, I don't think it's going to be great for everybody else.
yeah,
But it is going to be really, I mean, I'm definitely thinking about this in the context of aid. What's going to happen with aid? Who's going to step in if the US pulls out of all of these arrangements that it's had?
yeah.
What World Health, like international organizations. Again, I don't think they're going away, but they're going to look pretty different.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's a bit different, I'm 72 and I've been involved with American politics since I was a teenager, and my dad became a celebrity in the right wing, and I was his kind of nepotistic sidekick. I'm very involved. My parents would stay in the Ford White House and the Lincoln bedroom and do things that were very connected to the power structure at that time. But there was a kind of a basic changelessness that you assumed certain things would not go away no matter who was president. And the one thing that the Trump administration that has done amongst many things that is very different from anything I ever lived through before or experienced is a level of personal self-dealing and corruption that I've never seen before.
Mhm.
So, Nixon was not good, but Nixon was not using the US federal system to enrich himself.
Mhm.
You had senators and congressmen who occasionally would buy stocks knowing that something was going to happen and maybe got a little money out of it. But when you look at the Trump clan, um, they are much closer to Putin and what he has done in stealing billions of dollars from the Russian people. Trump has monetized what he does. And of course, once again, your average MAGA voter worried about paying his bills on the farm in Iowa somewhere is totally left in the dust. So you have a level of corruption. So your book is about the kind of people that are very wealthy, hide money, cheat, steal, lie their way through life in order to hang on to their wealth. That now seems to be the policy of the US government. It's not just a few individuals. The Trump administration favors those people at the
Mhm.
expense of all the rest of us and isn't even pretending not to, which is why you have these group pictures at his inauguration with all these Jeff Bezos and everybody else, grinning in the background, sucking up to him because they're afraid of him and they want to be part of the thing, but also he is one of them. He's not trying to legislate in order to curtail some of their power or level the playing field for the rest of us. He's basically the same kind of person that those bankers in Zurich and Geneva are, catering to his own followers and clients, and they're not the people who voted for him. So I don't know whether you feel the same way. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I am absolutely stunned by the level of corruption we now have in self-dealing, something that I've never seen before anywhere even close to the presidency, let alone the president.
Yeah, if you read there's a recently a New York Times article about Trump's crypto dealings and like
Right.
cryptocurrency stuff, and it's like, wow, this is it's so sinister and so shady.
Yeah.
Uh, there's no shame, there. I think that a lot of the conventions, the political conventions we've come to take for granted, are kind of getting blown up, and that can
Yeah.
be really disturbing.
Yeah,
You
and another aspect that's sort of weirdly similar to your history of Geneva is that Trump was put in power by white evangelicals, many of whom come from a Calvinist tradition or a Southern Baptist tradition, but some Protestant tradition or Roman Catholic tradition, derivative of the kind of faith issues that actually had plunged Europe into so many wars of religion, to which Geneva then becomes a shelter, then is driven by the theology of Calvin that kind of blesses wealth. Well, exactly the same people are now in the White House as his spiritual advisors, people like Paula White, who herself has been um, accused of corruption on a level that almost landed her in jail a couple of times for the kind of fundraising she does. So it just seems to me it's very weird that here we are in 2025 and we have a kind of a powerful group of people who were put in power by religious believers who have a direct connection back into Calvin's Geneva, whether they know it or not. And here we go again.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they probably don't know it. Like a lot of these people don't seem like the most well-read
Yeah, to put it mildly.
people. Yeah. I also ask myself, like, all eras come to an end. Where are these guys going to go? Like, what will be their Geneva? Who's going to take them in? My guess is the Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. And
Oh.
isn't that an interesting relationship? The Saudis who were financed and provided 19 of the 20 hijackers for 9/11, and all of a sudden they're our best buddies. And the other best buddy is Putin. I mean, how do you figure that?
Listen, the Trump-Putin relationship is a bit baffling. I don't know.
But how do you figure all of a sudden these evangelical Christians who backed Trump and who believe in America's greatness or something or other. How do you? I mean, you live in the States now. How do you figure them for the Saudis' best friends?
Listen, I don't know. There's a lot of weird stuff going on where some evangelical Christians are really pro-Israel, and maybe they see this as a move for to help Israel because of their beliefs around that. Maybe it really is just a play on domestic social issues where they don't want abortions, they don't want gay marriage,
Yeah,
maybe supporting Trump as a means to that end. I don't think they're all brain dead. I think that they have probably been thinking strategically. But I'm a provincial New Yorker. I don't really have any insights into this kinds of thinking.
I mean, it just seems to me that there are so many weird things on the table now between religious people backing Trump on the one hand, tied back into the corruption that came from Geneva.
Yeah. Why do
How
you
do you see that?
why do you think the religious people are backing Trump? What's your take on that? Because I think you're actually much better positioned to answer that than I am.
I think it was an incremental thing. I think that the left made a real error in the last 50 years. Um, a lot of my friends on the left, and I'm someone of the left, don't want to admit this, but there was a lot of trolling of the
Hmm.
evangelical community needlessly.
Hmm.
Um, you think about drag story hour or pronouns, this kind of thing. People on the left don't take all this very seriously, but you can read the New York Times for 10 years, and most of the books that are reviewed about, say, sexuality are all going to be on the side of, polyamory is liberating, um, unconventional relationships. And when you add it all up, it's not just one thing, but it's a sense that many evangelical Christians and Roman Catholics feel that the culture left them.
That things are changing faster than they're really willing or happy to. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly. And they believe in biblical prophecy, and God has raised up this king called Trump. And he's not a good person. They all know this. He's a philandering, person with credible accusations of rape, etc. But then again, so were some of the bad Syrian kings who helped the people of God at the right time in the biblical times. Um, so basically, it's kind of a religious jump of faith that somehow God has provided this man to lead us out of this secular wilderness.
hmm
And he's president because many evangelicals and Roman Catholics felt the culture had abandoned them. And of
hmm
course, I think a lot of the evangelical critique of this kind of leftist position on certain things, now a lot of people on the left, if you read The Guardian, you'll find very strong articles in The Guardian saying why is porn sex education for 11-year-olds now they're worried about it. But for years, it was a civil libertarian matter of combined with sexuality, these kind of things. And I just think 50 years of it was enough. And then Roe v. Wade was a point around which they could all coalesce. Okay, abortion's murder, we're going to roll it back. So there were
yeah,
flashpoints, but I think under all the flashpoints you read a lot about was a general malaise,
yeah,
feeling the culture has been stolen
yeah.
uh, by
Like,
clever people in the universities and the media. And Trump said, look, I mean, he said it straight. I'll be your revenge. I won't just win. I will revenge myself on these people for you. And he's doing it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, cultural shifts can be very powerful and really turn people out to vote, right? But then the question is, what happens when these voters have their Medicare, their Medicaid cut, and the social benefits, and like the sort of start to feel the economic brunt of it.
Sure.
And that I think that's when we come full circle to like maybe a bigger realization of all of the wealth that is not being used to help
Yeah.
that voted for Trump,
Well,
right?
and
And
that's why I think your book is so important because there's what I'm talking about is conjecture, but the
Mhm.
truth of the matter is the that Trump represents are thieves, and they
Yeah,
have conned you. Trump University, his shitty steaks, everything he sold, the casino business, he's a flake. And so is Elon Musk. I mean, he's got billions of dollars, but if you dig a little under the surface with these guys, how they treat the women in their lives, how they treat the people that they use and abuse and discard, they all have a similar pattern, and they fit very well with the descriptions in your book about the kind of people that hide money. I
yeah.
think,
Yeah, and beyond that, there are people who take advantage of these loopholes, but then I think what I've tried to do in the book is to talk about the people who create them and the ways that these emerge, the ways they come about. And it's not always a bunch of guys rubbing their hands together in a room. A lot of it is contingent, someone falls into a profession, realizes there's an opportunity, talks to a guy. And so a lot of this is like it's a little bit more up to chance than we think as well. That this isn't to say that um that's a good thing or a bad thing. What
yeah.
I mean, you can intervene and change the course
But one
of.
point you made that I really relate to, and you say it in your book, but you said it here too a few minutes ago, that I think is brilliant, and I'm going to just say it. And that is that you talked about the fact that things aren't changing in the way people think they are. There's a kind of a steady resolve on the part of the very wealthy. Their part of the system's not changing. So, when you look at what's happening with Trump, The kind of people who are going to be hurt are not Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk or him or Jared Kushner. Their money is all sheltered somewhere. They're taken care of. The stock market may fluctuate up and down. I'm going to have a lot less to retire on because I haven't done the clever thing and found some, but offshore place to stick it all. They have long ago. So the amazing thing is Trump is this populist, but actually, I think his presidency is empowering um, the wealthy in a way that no American presidency ever has, because his inner circle, those kinds of people, no matter what happens, they've taken care of themselves.
Have to go offshore for that. I mean, he's cutting taxes domestically as well for the very
Sure.
so yeah, I mean, absolutely. His class interests are aligned with theirs. He's because he's one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, hey, anyway, we're going to do your book, um, and I'm going to just talk about the title one more time. Hold up your British edition and grab
I
an
will
American one for next time we talk about it.
UK.
So read the title and the subtitle for me.
So it's called The Hidden Globe: How Wealth Hacks the World. And the subtitle is referring to the fact that, national borders exist for all of us, but they don't exist so much for money and for the people who have it.
Right. So we're going to do your book as part of our book club in July. It has to be read. And I just really want to thank you for writing an incredible book. And the great thing is, I relate so much to the sections on Switzerland, but because I kind of understand that world a little bit, having grown up in it myself,
Yeah.
um, it was a real eye opener when it comes to how this is kind of multiplied. What has been the feedback to the book?
It's been great. It's been really good feedback. I've gotten a lot of people in Geneva read it and sort of related to it. And I guess to me, because I spent so long trying to get a grip on why I felt so weird about Geneva, it was validating to get notes from people who said sort of the same thing. Like, I live here too, and wow, like I also ha had the sunnies. So that's been, and then, any reader feedback is welcome, but those types of notes were particularly
Good.
uh,
Well,
beneficial.
hey, as I said at the beginning of the interview, you'll enjoy Eurotrash by Christian Kracht. It's a good novel. It's short, it's an easy read, it's so entertaining, and it's literally like an appendix to your book. It's the fiction version of what you wrote.
Terrific. Well, I'm gonna go read that. I have it, so I'm gonna go read that.
Good, you'll love it. Well, I won't tell you to love it, but you'll find it very interesting. I think you'll love it.
Well,
Hey,
thanks.
thank you very much. Is there anything that I forgot to mention? One thing I just want you to do is when I sign off here, please stick around for a couple minutes and talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, because we do two things. We want to make sure we set you up properly with all the links and everything else to what you want to pitch, because we want to pitch your book for the book club. But we also want suggestions from you if you're thinking, well, gee, Frank would be interested in talking to so and so. We always love getting people's names who have done the work. And one thing that so impressed me about your book is that it reminded me of Edsel in the New York Times, and that is most of us have to quote other people's books. And you have this thing of, oh, well, when I interviewed so and so, here's what he said to me. And I, I thought that's very impressive.
Thank
Like
you.
you're a real journalist, you chased it down and did it in person, which just blew me away. It's like, oh, wow, she talked to him.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll stick around, talk to Ernie.
Yeah, do that. Thank you so much. And we'll be back. We'll plug the book, whatever else you do, we're interested in. And thank you. Thank you for taking the time.